Your musical? A cultural history of Little Shop of Horrors, which I read from cover to cover in preparation for tonight, and it is very well written and meticulously researched, and indeed, you are an academic.
I am an academic, and I want to thank you and Kevin and Magda for inviting me to join you at the Lambs. I'm happy to be surrounded by these theatrical luminaries and pieces of the past.
But as an academic, and this research like you're doing a scholarly tome, what drew you to this material?
I would say, first of all, although it is scholarly, it is meant to be readable and accessible. It is scholarly in that it is true. Every single thing in there is true insofar as I could determine it. There are many, many footnotes showing you where I found things. But I wouldn't like to think of it as an academic book. It's still meant to be accessible to the regular average reader, if there is such a thing. But the answer to your question is, I always loved the work of Howard Ashman. He's the director, lyricist, and author of Little Shop of Horrors. He came from theater in New York, and then, as many know, he went on to work for the Walt Disney Company, where he helped create films like The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, and Aladdin. So to me,
Little Shop precedes all of
Little
that.
Shop came first.
Yes.
That opened in New York City in 1982, and he collaborated with Alan Menken, the composer. And this was only the third show they did together, but this one was really the breakthrough. The first two were not as successful.
But there was something about this show that caught you, and that's what I wanted to find out.
Well, the
Something
reason
about the show.
the reason I
True
knew
confessions.
the reason I knew that it was a book and not just a cocktail conversation topic is that Little Shop has this really strange trajectory. It began, as you know, as a really cheap movie made in Los Angeles over just a couple of days around Christmas 1959, directed by Roger Corman, who was known for making movies really cheap and really quickly. And he claimed he wanted to beat his own record for speed. He typically could shoot a film in 5 or 6 days. That's a feature film in 5 or 6 days of production. So he thought, could I do it any quicker? His aim was to make a movie in just 2 days. That's a 60-plus minute film in 2 days. He didn't quite do it. It was more like 4 days. That was the story behind Little Shop. And he made a film called The Little Shop of Horrors, which is a black and white movie with Seymour and this plant that eats people. And in theory, that would be forgotten and lost forever, except in maybe...
What is your opinion of the film?
The film is not great. There was a...
Put it mildly.
I mean, Corman had no idea that any of the films he made in the 50s and 60s would be remembered. They were meant to be grist for the mill. One of the people I interviewed described his view of films like Kleenex, like you use it and throw it away. It was about as useful as a piece of Kleenex. So he had no idea this film would last, or that people would revive it in the form of a musical. There is a better Corman film made the same year that's similar, and that is called Bucket of Blood. I don't know if you guys have seen Bucket of Blood. It's actually pretty solid, and you can see that's the same director and same writer because the two stories have a similar shape. They both have a kind of nebbishy, nerdy guy. They have a woman he loves. They have a workplace scenario. In Bucket of Blood, it's a cafe. In Little Shop, it's, as you know, a florist shop in an unnamed city. And in both cases, Bucket of Blood and Little Shop, through some strange circumstance, the hero becomes a kind of murderer, and this gets him fame and love and everything he wanted. So there's a structural similarity between Bucket of Blood, made a few months earlier, and Little Shop. Bucket of Blood's probably the better film, but Little Shop somehow had a certain something that translated to the musical stage.
What did they, Ashman and Menken, see in this material that could be musicalized? What could be a more unlikely musical setting than a story of a plant who devours the world?
The story goes that Ashman saw this film on television when he was young and impressionable. Maybe 1964, 65. He says he was around 14 years old. And he caught this thing and just captivated his teenage imagination. And he remembered this film and loved it. Whenever it would play on television again, he would invite friends over, and they would all sit around the television and watch this film. Just after he graduated from high school, he wound up writing a plagiarism of Little Shop called The Candy Shop, where he essentially regurgitated the elements. There was a singing plant named Ethel, which I believe was named for Ethel Merman, because Ashman admired the Broadway star Merman and Gypsy. So he basically wrote a ripoff of it, Then he forgot about it. Years later, in the 1970s, he's living in New York, and he's trying to come up with shows to produce in his theater. He's now running the WPA Theater, a not-for-profit on Lower Fifth Avenue. And as he says, Little Shop just came back to me. He remembered loving this story as a child. He remembered loving something about the relationship between the plant and this man, Seymour, who aids and abets the plant in these murders. And he saw that this show would have a gimmick. You know, it's very hard to get your work seen, to get your work heard, and they're in a tiny theater, they have no money, no budget, this is not Broadway, this is off-Broadway, and he thought if we have a play, and we could somehow build this plant, and put it right in the middle of the stage, then everybody will notice. And that's exactly what he did.
But he made some interesting changes from the movie. The movie, has anybody seen this?
Yeah.
The
The
Little
movie
Shop?
from 1960? It has, I suppose you could almost say, Jewish stereotyping. Mr. Mushnick and Mrs. Shiva, who's always sitting Shiva for a relative who's died, and he gets off on all her agony. And if you're Jewish like I am, you identify with the character and you understand it. But they wisely, I think, removed much of that in the musical. Was that a conscious decision? Let's not make it so Jewish. Let's not go to the Jewish stereotype. It almost feels like a Woody Allen film in part of Little Shop.
Yeah, I never heard that it was consciously selected, but it was an issue when the film was first released. Some critics in 1960 and some exhibitors thought the film The Little Shop of Horrors was anti-Semitic because of some of these stereotypical presentations. There's a shop owner, Mr. Mushnick, who seems clearly Jewish. He's financially benefiting from these murders, and he's okay with that because he's making some money. So there's something unsavory about some of this, and the exhibitors didn't like it. And yet, Ashman and many of his Jewish friends in Baltimore County saw this film and embraced it, really enjoyed it. So I think that Ashman just, in so many ways, wisely adapted this work. And what he did so well is took something that's pretty good, that's kind of good, that's flawed and weak, but with a great concept, takes what is good about it, lets the other things kind of fall by the wayside. So you could argue that Seymour and Mushnick are Jewish in the play, but that's not really an issue. It's more just, they seem like New Yorkers, even though it's not identified as a city. The Skid Row is an anonymous city. So I never heard that Ashman consciously moved away from that decision, but he just had the ability to improve upon his source.
He doesn't get stuck in ethnic stereotyping, because you could, if you took the movie literally, if you made a literal adaptation, you could get caught in that. And he doesn't do that.
Well, I would mention that in the Roger Corman film from 1960, there was the character of Seymour's mother. And Seymour's mother is this kind of overbearing hypochondriac. Again, religion is not mentioned, but you get the sense that this is a kind of stereotypical character. She's very tedious, and there are many long scenes of her eating. She eats all sorts of weird things because she's aware of her health. So Ashman just took that character out. So if you go to see the play, you'd never know that Seymour once had a mother. Something that Disney would do as well. Always kill the mother, and then your character is much more sympathetic. So Seymour, in the musical, is now an orphan, as you said, a child of the streets. So he's more kind of at the mercy of Mushnick and the situation. So it's a good piece of adaptation.
It's a brilliant adaptation, really. Now, for the music, what sort of sound did they want? Something that evoked the period when the film was released? Pop music of the late 50s, early 60s?
The interesting story here is that, again, Little Shop took a journey. When they first started working on it, as far as I can tell, Ashman and Menken were trying a more Gothic musical style. Recall, they're writing this in 1981. Sweeney Todd opened recently, 1979, on Broadway, and it's an example of how to do a kind of thriller, I think it was called a musical thriller, on the stage. So the first draft of Little Shop, the musical, seems maybe closer to Kurt Weill, a little bit more Grand Guignol, a little bit more like that, and it wasn't quite working. Something wasn't clicking. At the same time, they're writing other songs that are more just straight musical theater and cheerful, and then Ashman had the realization that to write this as a musical, the key would be to write the songs as if they were from the period in which the story takes place. And it's interesting because Ashman saw it as a child, so he saw it in the 60s. So for him, it kind of connects to his own childish enjoyment of the girl groups of the period, like the Crystals, the Ronettes, and the Chiffons, and the Shangri-Las. So he thought maybe the musical should sound like that. And the term he came up with, they called it the dark side of Greece. So that's what he and Mencken agreed upon. And then that became the concept for how to write the musical. And from then on, it went rather quickly. So it did have that journey.
But the sound is the right sound for the musical, and as we'll talk when we introduce the actors, the movement is right. The show had an immediate success, did it not? It went right from the WPA to the Orpheum and Off-Broadway Theater, and then to London, and nationally, Los Angeles. It was a huge success right away.
It seemed to have clicked pretty quickly in this first incarnation, as I said, off-Broadway, 4 weeks, in a tiny little hole-in-the-wall theater, 98 seats, because that was the equity maximum for off-Broadway. And I think tickets were $7, and they only took cash. So this is the kind of venue it began in. And the word of mouth spread. People who worked on the show told me there were lines around the block, limousines pulling up, people from Midtown and out of town and other places were coming to see it. And ultimately, the Shubert organization, Cameron McIntosh and David Geffen, all wanted to mount the show somewhere in a commercial house. Now, the natural thing at this point would be go to Broadway. You've got the Shuberts, who own more Broadway theaters than anybody alive. And yet, Ashman always had the vision that this should be a smaller, more intimate piece. So he insisted on off-Broadway endeavor, and that's how they found the Orpheum, which still stands on 2nd Avenue, where Stomp has been playing for many years. So moved just about 2 months after the opening at the WPA. It's now an off-Broadway show, running it as a commercial endeavor, where it played for years.
Wasn't the Orpheum the right place for it? Because at that time, 2nd Avenue, when you walked outside the theater, you felt as though in a way it was an extension of the setting of the show.
Precisely, and I mean, Roger Corman, the original filmmaker, eventually made it to New York on a trip. He went to see Little Shop based on his film, and what he really appreciated is when you walk out the end, it seems like you're on Skid Row, the setting of the play. Now 2nd Avenue and the East Village are more gentrified, but at the time 2nd Avenue was definitely a little bit more.
It was a little funky in those days.
Yeah.
It was just the right place for this show, and it was smart not to go to Broadway.
And over the show is selling out, it's making money, and during its 5-year run, there was always this suggestion, hey, let's move it uptown, we'll give you the booth, we'll give you, whatever Broadway house you like. So the temptation is there, and at any point, Ashman could have moved the show to a Broadway house and made more money, even been nominated for a Tony Award, even won a Tony Award, but it was his instinct that said, no, this is where it belongs, this is the house, it's a little bit run down, it's a little bit of a degenerate neighborhood, you come here, and now you're having this experience. You've gone to Skid Row, you've entered this kind of world, and now you're seeing this presentation.
When they did the movie, when the movie was made, and it was shocking for me because I had not seen the movie till I did research for tonight. For some reason, I never saw the movie. The movie has a happy ending. At the end of the show, everybody's eaten. Everybody's dead. Don't feed the plants is the last line. And it's really scary. It's like Sweeney Todd. But the movie gives it a happy ending. Was that the right decision for the movie?
Movies are expensive. Movies have to please the mass audience. Movies have to appeal to 13 to 17-year-olds who are going to the mall, who are going to play video games, and then see a film, and then go have a milkshake or whatever they did in that period. So movies get test marketed, and they would have test screenings. And I mean, famously, when Citizen Kane was test marketed, the audience didn't like it. They would write those note cards, you'd see a movie, and then you fill out little cards. When Citizen Kane showed before a test audience, someone wrote, people like laughs, L-A-F-F-S. So meaning that Citizen Kane is not funny enough. So audiences have always had the opportunity to critique Hollywood films, and Little Shop, the movie version from 1986, went through this process, and the audience did not like the ending. And the studio got scared and thought this is supposed to be a big summer blockbuster. Now it looks like a disaster. The audience hates us. We killed the characters they love. We have to shoot a new ending. So Ashman wrote the new ending because he thought he could at least do it his way rather than have a hack come in and do it worse. But he had to corrupt his own piece in order to make it.
But it feels right for the movie somehow. The happy ending didn't bother me.
I think if you didn't know the play and you didn't know the Corman film, you would enjoy the movie in and of itself. It works in its own way. I mean, Seymour could win.
Right.
It's possible. So, yeah, to me, what's interesting about Little Shop is it really is 3 different things. And depending on who you are, when you hear the word Little Shop of Horrors, you might think of the Roger Corman film of 1960. You might think of the musical which played in New York in the 80s. Or for many, you might think of The Friend Oz film from '86, because many people saw that first. They saw it on cable television, they saw it on home video, and when they hear Little Shop, they think of the film with Rick Moranis and Steve Martin. And only later they say, oh, that was on the stage, and then they see the play with a different ending. So I think it depends on which Little Shop you access first. But what's interesting about this project is there are really 3 Little Shops, and each is its own distinct thing. They're genetically connected, but non-identical.
And now, of course, there's the revival at the West Side, and it's doing well, isn't it? Very well.
It is, yeah. I mean, it began in 2019, pre-pandemic, if you can remember that period. And I was fortunate to see it in 2019. But here is the big distinction. The show was also revived, as you may recall, in 2003, but then it was put on Broadway at the then Virginia Theater, and many thought that it was a mistake to put it on Broadway. It was not the right kind of house for the show, which is what Ashwin always thought. So by the time the recent revival came around, the Ashwin estate was very insistent, this has to be off Broadway. We have to find a way to make it work economically. That's what Ashwin wanted. That's the kind of show it is. And the West Side Theater, which is 270 seats, is a pretty good approximation of the Orpheum. It's probably nicer, but it still gives you that sense of being in that smaller space where a show with 8 people and a plant feels right.
I saw it about 2 weeks ago. The audience loves it.
I know.
They absolutely are enraptured with this show. It has a huge cult following, and it's going to be around for a long time. It connects to people.
I mean, think how many works of art from 1982 would be hard to watch today, would be cringy, and require explanation. And when I saw this production 3 times, and the audience just swallows it as if it were written yesterday. It requires no context. It requires no note in the playbill to explain what you're seeing, and it really requires no rewrites. As far as I could tell, it was word and note, exactly the show that Ashwin and Menken wrote. So many Broadway revivals, they rewrite it, there's a new book, they somehow feel obliged, whether it's incorrect or incorrect, to rewrite or adapt or update the show. Little Shop is pretty much the same, and it has this timeless quality.
There is something I missed in your very thorough book. I was waiting. Is he going to ever get to the metaphor of the plant and the sexual imagery? It's right there, but you don't touch it.
I basically made a conscious decision not to do interpretation, not to do hermeneutics, not to say this X means Y. It's very easy to do X means Y or X is Y.
But doesn't the material invite that kind of interpretation?
You could read any number of texts. You could read that painting. So I just made a decision not to do that kind of book. There is a model for this kind of book where someone chooses one particular musical and writes the story top to bottom. There's a couple good ones. There's one in Oklahoma. There's one on Showboat by one of my favorite people, Miles Kruger, who's an historian of musical theater. And often there's the chapter that's the interpretation chapter, where the person throws all his or her interpretations in. I decided not to do that chapter. My view is The Little Shop exists, it's available, you can read it, you can see the movie, you can go to the theater here or a local neighborhood theater, and you can interpret it. So I decided not to impose myself and my own interpretation, because it would just be one interpretation of many.
I'm glad to hear that. I had written the book, I would have written that chapter, and I might have gotten into a lot of trouble.
Sometimes you restrain your hand.
Yes.
And there was lots of explicative things that I kept out. I purposely avoid the words camp and cult, because I don't have to define the words camp and cult. So I really tried to tell the story of how this thing came to be. And I do think it is a cultural history, as the title argues. It is the story of how this thing happened. How did Ashwin and Menken and their collaborators do this thing? How do we go from Roger Corman shooting a movie for a few $1,000s on a borrowed soundstage near Sunset Boulevard in studios that once were owned by Charlie Chaplin? How do you go from that to this hit musical in New York, to a multi-million-dollar film shooting in London, to revivals everywhere? Every year, the show is done professionally in amateur productions.
What you do, though, as you take us through the different productions, is you place this against the context of musical theater evolution.
Right.
It's like other shows of its time, and it is a pioneer in other ways as well. So you place it against a historical background. You are a historian, that does come across.
Yeah, well, again, I like the term cultural history. I think that is the right term for it. It is always embedded in the context of the time and place. what were the filmmaking practices of the 1950s that allowed Roger Corman to thrive. The studios were falling. There was, even before the MPAA, films were getting a little bit more sexual, violence. There was a kind of filmmaking that thrived in that period. Corman taps into that, makes a movie that's kind of gritty and tough that the studio wouldn't touch. All the characters you like die. To the context of the 1970s, in which Ashman and Menken were learning their craft and trying to break into theater, and then from there. So there's a way in which I'm always trying to embed it in the historical context and the cultural and artistic context, but that's not the same thing as interpretation.
Okay.
That I
Okay.
resist. But you're welcome to tell me your interpretation.
We'll talk about it privately.
Okay.
Okay, but I do want now to present, I always love the idea of originals. I'm partial to whatever is original. Adam invited tonight 2 of the original cast members of the WPA production who went on to the Orpheum production, and I'm thrilled to bring them to the stage. Sheila K. Davis, who was the original Ronette, and Frank Luz, who was the original very wicked dentist, Lawrence Scrivillo.
Thank you.
You're the presenter.
You had it, your turn. You had to travel all the way from 1982 to get here, so you deserve
Welcome to both of you. I love originals, so it's a thrill to meet 2 original members of the cast. So I have some questions for you guys. First of all, Frank, you played a character who was not in the movie. Was not in the original movie at all.
Correct.
No, there's a dentist.
Jack Nicholson played.
No, there's a dentist, but the part is smaller.
The part is
His name is
small.
Phoebus Farb, and there is a dentist who gets off on cruelty, but
And nobody remembers him because Jack Nicholson was the object of the cruelty and he loved it.
Yeah, but he's not a major character at all.
no, he's in a scene and he dies.
He's a major character. What was your inspiration for playing the part? Were you given cultural models of James Dean? Your dentist is dressed in leather. He's a very weird guy.
Actually, I first got sent the script, and at that time I had I'd already worked at Broadway and done soaps and things. So I got the script, and I had heard about WPA Theater. It was one of the really good places to work. They did a lot of high quality work there, and some of their stuff moved. And I had already had that experience with Goodspeed Opera, so I thought, I should look at it. I read it, and I thought, this is the silliest thing I've ever read in my entire life. And I said, I don't see that this is a play. So I called my agent and I said, no, it's pure silliness. I don't understand it. No, it's not for me. So I turned it down. And next thing I know, Howard and Alan Menken sent over a little cassette tape. And the cassette tape, which I still have, which now I guess would be kind of a collector's item, but the cassette tape is Howard and Alan singing the entire score. And Howard could play any part and sing the entire thing. And then Alan had the most beautiful rock tenor voice, so he could sing all of Seymour's stuff. So it actually, was excellent. So I put the tape on, and I was living in 75th and Broadway. I put the tape on, and I called him. I said, "You want to hear this? This is the music that goes with that silly script I told you about." So I put the music on, and I think about 2-3 songs into it, she and I just went. She said, "Call your agent." And I said, "I'm calling." So it didn't make sense to me until I heard the music. And then the music, and all of a sudden I pulled it all together and I thought, this is brilliant. I've got to meet the guy who created this. And so I went in and auditioned like everybody else. And and got it. So that's how that all happened. So my inspiration was, I wanted to be in a hit show. And this
But
was,
before
it
that-
sounded like a hit show.
Shayla, how did you get involved originally?
Well, at that time, I was 24 years old, and I was new to New York City, and I had done a show at the Amos. At that time, your pay was 2 tokens. You remember subway tokens? You got paid 2 tokens for the time that you came back and forth to the theater. I was in a show at the Amos Repertory Theater, and Dr. Michelangelo directed
Oh.
it. And Little Shop was essentially my second big audition. And I had run into a guy, and back in those days, you ran into people in what we called nightclubs, who said, I want to be your manager. And silly me said, sure. But then he sent me up on Little Shop. And it was, the audition was in the old WPA, which was a theater above a literal whorehouse. I'm not kidding.
Literally.
Literally. And action was in the elevator. And so, I'm not kidding. And this was right off, right in Chelsea. Right on, was 18th Street, right off the Avenue.
19th.
19th Street.
Yeah.
Went upstairs, auditioned, Howard was there, and we had an immediate connection. It was one of those things where I said, I know I've got this job. I knew nothing about,
You knew you had the job?
I knew I had the job. You know, in a lot of cases instantly. Very seldom are you surprised. When you've blown an audition, you know it right away too. You know,
You were good and you knew you were what they were looking for?
I knew I had a connection with Howard Ashman immediately. Because he lined us all up. I mean, and we all had to do the little, the steps, and we had to sing and whatever. And we just locked eyes. And I said, okay, I knew nothing about the script. I knew nothing about the WPA. I basically knew nothing about anything.
But you were right for this book.
Absolutely, absolutely. And
And your Leilani Jones and Jennifer Lee Warren, the other original free urchins, did they have the same connection?
we
immediate
left
connection?
together. I'm still very good friends with Leilani to this day.
To this day?
Yeah, our kids are friends, and but it was a very unusual experience, and I wouldn't say it was a problem in getting a show so quickly, but after that, I kind of held Howard up to every other director that I worked with, and that's not fair. You know what I mean? Because there was, as Frank said, he could dance, act, sing, do everything.
He really was truly brilliant. It's an overused word, but this guy was a force of nature, just utterly and completely brilliant.
But here you have the writer of the show also directing the show.
Yes.
Is that good or bad?
In his case, necessary.
Necessary.
The show never would have gotten birthed the way it did without his amazing direction. He always knew what he wanted. He was so clear on it. And I remember saying to him sometimes, typical actor, saying things like, I don't think my character would do this. And he said, oh yes, he would.
That's the same thing that I told Adam, is that he knew exactly what he wanted. And that, as I said, as time went on, every director is not that way. A lot of directors are just like, well, what do you got? And they just move you across the stage like a marching band. He could sing, act, dance, he could do your part. And he let you know it.
Did you have to imitate him, or did he give you room to improvise and create?
Every choice he made, unfortunately, was the right one.
Oh.
Yes.
The trick of this show with performance is, it's funny, but you can't play it for satire or camp. There has to be a certain emotional reality. There has to be a certain seriousness along with the humor.
Frank, I'm sorry. Let me get this, because this is
Get
kind of about you.
Get it.
Am I right about that?
You're absolutely right. They did a production of Little Shop at Ossining High School about 6 months ago, and they invited me up as a special guest, and it was so wonderful. But the guy who played Oren, he was a young football player, and he came to me and he said, you know what, I can't hit a girl. He said, my football coach is telling me I'll never have a career if I hit a girl. I can't play this part. I can't be mean and evil like that. And then I thought about how I grew up, where men hit women. It was not a crime. And it wasn't until literally, I think it was Joe Biden who did the Domestic Violence Act. But as far as 1982, that was not a law. The police would come, but it would be like you would damage your own property and blah, 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 blah. But nowadays, this young man said, I cannot hit Audrey and I don't want her to have a black eye. Frank Loves, who I hadn't seen since 1985, is one of the sweetest, kindest, most loving person on this earth who I will never forget. And I hadn't seen him since 85. But Frank would go on and just be this evil mofo. Having that, because he was a sadist.
The character.
Right.
So
So,
it has to be played with certain reality, you're saying?
go take it, Frank.
Actually, I was used to doing stage slaps and stage fighting and all that stuff because I've done a lot of theater. And so the first time we rehearsed the scene with Ellen Green, with Audrey, and I go out there and I did, a little thing like with my little fingertips. I just went, like that kind of a thing. Because as long as it makes some kind of a sound and, just the act alone should be enough. Ellen said, hit me harder. No, really hit me. And I said, what, we're going to be doing this 8 times a week. And how many times are we going to do it in rehearsal? Hundreds? I said, you really want me to? Yes. So she actually was the one. So eventually, I come out in the entrance of the character and first thing I walk up to her and I slap her, and that's what she wanted. Ellen always knew what she wanted.
That's
Frank,
a
that
very
was
good
not-
segue. That's a good segue. Adam, I want to bring you in here. In reading the book, how do I phrase this? In reading the book, a kind of villain emerges. And the villain, or at least the person who is not going to win any popularity contests, is Ellen Green. She didn't give you an interview for the book, I gather, and our wonderful actress can attest to this. It was apparently very difficult. She is absolutely brilliant in that part. I saw her in it at City Center when there were 2 performances with Jake Gyllenhaal. Did you happen to see that?
No.
You were there?
That was the only
Yeah.
time I've ever seen Little Shop.
Oh, really? She's amazing. She owns that part. It's like Barbara Streisand in Funny Girl. She owns that part and nobody can play it. We're seeing proof of that at the moment. But Ellen Green owns that part. She's brilliant.
She
She's
is.
stunning. Was she difficult?
Well, let me respond, since you mentioned me. I would not use the word villain, because a villain implies an antagonist, a nemesis, someone who has a different goal than you have, someone who blocks and obstructs your goal. Her goal was the same as every single person at WPA, to put the best show on possible. She had her own process, she was challenging for those around her, but she wanted to do a good performance, to do the show that Ashman and Menken wrote, and to make it great. So was she difficult along the way? Sure. But many actors and artists can be difficult, but that is not working against the piece or working against anyone in particular. It was always towards that goal. Her process was maybe a complicated one, but yeah, she always wanted what Ashman and Menken wanted for the show to be great. So you can tell me if
She and Ashman were similar, actually, because Ashman always knew what every second of that show he wanted it to look like and sound like. Ellen knew every second or microsecond of what she wanted Audrey to look and sound like. And as he details in the book, when she came in to audition and she sang Suddenly Seymour, Howard said, that's exactly how I heard it when I wrote it. And so she is brilliant. Like she told me, don't really slap her. And then, of course, it's a love story, and really she and Lee Wilcox, the original Seymour, really worked so closely together. She directed him, and how she how she wanted him to, do their various different moves in the show and things, and she would set up full-length mirrors. So Howard knew when he hired her. She had a well-known reputation as being very passionate, brilliant, and difficult. She had that reputation, so there were very few people who were going to take that on, even though they really wanted what she would deliver, because she would. I'm not sure the show would have been the amazing hit it would have been without her. So it was a difficult process with her, but she got there, and like Adam said, we were all trying to get there and find the right balance. You said something. You led this whole question thing off by playing it real and then playing it for
But the
laughs.
balance.
The
show
balance.
has to have this
That was
delicate
the
balance.
single most difficult thing to find in rehearsal, because Howard, when he cast us, we were very idiosyncratic performers. We weren't musical theater at all. Me, myself. So what happened was, I was used to playing some dark characters and soaps and different things. But so I was, that part, I had no problem with connecting with. But Howard would say, I need you to do one thing with this scene. I said, what is that? He said, put on your comedy ears. He said, do exactly what you're doing, but your comedy ears. He said, there's 5 people in this business who can do what you do, put them on. And from that point on, whenever we were rehearsing or giving notes or doing a scene, he wouldn't even have to, he'd just look at me and go. And I go,
So the menace has to be
real.
real.
Yeah,
but
you
it
have
has
to,
to have
yeah.
comedy in it.
Yeah, you can't play it very broadly and, until you do. So when you get to the dentist number, when he, does the reveal and he's the dentist, by that time, you was talking about evil, but you have to be delighting in it. It has, you just have to be, it's not evil for evil. It's like, oh, it feels so good. And then the chorus, the narrative.
Well, I want, they're called the urchins, I guess.
Yes, the
But they're
urchins.
wonderful characters, but they are characters.
Yes,
And
they
didn't
are.
you each have a sort of backstory, or you wrote a history for each of the characters? You had a sense of who they were.
Absolutely, because Crystal, Ronette, and Chiffon were real girl groups. And I don't know if you remember the Ronettes, be my baby. It was very monotone type singing. One fine day, you're gonna walk me for, those were the Crystals, the Ronettes, the Chiffons. So in the later incarnations, when I hear all this gospel riffing going on, I'm like, wait, it wasn't based on Patti LaBelle and the Bluebells. It was based on the Crystals, the Ronettes, and the Chiffons. And Howard actually developed an act for the 3 of us. We were going to sing the music of the Crystals, the Ronettes, and the Chiffons in a club act. And one of these songs, and I kid you not, because I have the sheet music to this day, was called He Hit Me, But It Felt Like a Kiss. That was one of the songs that was going to be in the show. So I just feel like the urchins have gotten further and further away from who the Crystals, the Ronettes, and the Chiffons were. But then again, I was a person who was directed by the person who wrote it. And I can't expect every director in perpetuity to have, every director has a right to have their own interpretation.
But didn't Howard Ashman give each of the 3 of you a character identification? You had something to work with. You weren't the same. You weren't 3 of them were the same. You
No.
were 3 distinct personalities.
3 distinct personalities. It wasn't just our job to move the show along. We were a distinct part of the cast. That's when Adam wrote in the book about when Equity put us on the pink contract. And Howard fought because he felt we were principals. Because we did, the line that I had, we went to school until the 5th grade and then we split. That's who she was.
That's who she was.
And that's what I told the young lady who was in high school, who was doing the role kind of like Beyonce. I said, no, she went to school to the 5th grade, then she split. He explained, you know, we did table reads. So it wasn't just, let's put on a musical show and just shake it.
No, you were specific characters.
Right.
Specific characters with a backstory.
Absolutely, absolutely. All of the characters I feel in Little Shop are very well defined.
And you come from a specific place. The three young women come from a particular background.
Oh, yeah, oh, yeah. And in working with Howard Ashman, Alan Menken, and Fivish Finkel, I learned an awful lot, okay, of history, you know, because Fivish came from the old Yiddish theater. I learned an awful lot being in the Lower East Side, being a Southern African-American young woman. Little Shop was diversity before we had that word, you know? Because a lot of shows were not integrated the way Little Shop was back then, so.
And it was always understood that the urchins would be women of color.
Yeah, that was understood, but I've seen them all now. I haven't even seen them, I've seen them mixed gender now. I mean, you know, it's, I think that anyone could do it.
How important was the movement and the choreography?
We gave the choreographer a really hard time. But it's important, you know, because the show, it's a musical, it does move, but it wasn't as if it was a ballet in the middle of it.
But in this nice off-Broadway production, the three young women come out and their movement sets the tempo and beat for the entire show.
Oh, well, then maybe I'll go see it.
See it yet?
I told you, the only time I ever saw Little Shop of Horrors in my life was when Ellen and Jake Gyllenhaal did it. Did you ever see the show, Frank? See, that's a secret.
So you saw it at City Center when I saw it.
Yeah, because usually when you are doing a show, if you've been, you've had it. You've had that
So
baby.
as an audience member, what did you think then?
When I saw the high school kids?
No, at City Center.
Oh, I thought it was excellent. I thought Ellen was fantastic.
Fantastic. Unbelievable.
Was it a concert series like they, remember Chicago? There was
Yeah,
a,
City
so scaled
Center.
down concert.
It was scaled down, but
They
it
were
was,
playing.
it was scaled
They were
down,
playing.
but they actually did the show. I mean, it wasn't, they weren't reading, they did the show.
Well, can I say that Lynn Hippen, who was did the plant, is here? And our company manager, Nancy Gibbs, is here, right there.
They were small, but.
Well, the subway was 75 cents.
Now, when did you know that you were involved in a show that was going to be a great hit?
The night Barbara Streisand came.
At the WPA, the Orpheum.
She came to the Orpheum.
She came to the
Sat on the
Orpheum.
second row. That's when, I mean, oh.
You knew you were in a real hit. How long did you stay with the show?
5 years.
5 years?
5 years, yes.
You were in the entire run? of the
I
Orpheum?
left for a while and went out to LA and worked a little bit, and then I came back. I wasn't there for the closing though. I think I left 3 months before they closed.
5 years.
I was there a long time.
And how did you sustain your commitment to it? Were you interested in it the whole time?
I was the only cast member that was married, and I'm still married, 41 years later. In fact, these two, Lynn and her husband, that are here tonight, they met in the show and they're still together. They have 2 girls. But yeah, after a while, when you go see a long run, I think that the best thing is the new people coming in and out, because you have to continue to rehearse. You have to.
So that keeps it fresh?
That keeps it fresh. That keeps it fresh. And just all the friends that I made along the journey. But after that, to be honest with you, I first of all, I didn't come to the theater to do musical theater just like Frank. I knew Frank from the soaps and from film when he came into Little Shop. But most of us that were in Little Shop were not musical theater peoples per se. We were actors. So I thought that I would, go on and do Shakespeare in the Park, which I never did. And, other things like that. But Little Shop was definitely, especially now, it feels very different now. If this had been just 10 years after the show, this would be a different conversation.
40 years later.
Yes, especially for those who didn't make it. It's special.
Do you go to reunions? Are you asked to comment on the show by producers, and you went to high school productions?
Sheila does.
No, you're experts on the show. You were there.
As Adam knows, and I recounted it in the book, when I had waited a long time to go to LA, I did not want to go to LA like I came to New York, with $200 in my pocket and asking, where do you find the auditions? And so I learned about show business at the time and backstage. No, I think it's just backstage. But, and then I could be good at that one. And so I had waited to be in a show that was going to go to LA. I was hoping my first show would, but it had a good run in New York, but it didn't go to LA. And so I had waited, and I said, this is it. This is not only a show that's going to go to LA, this is a hit show that's going to go to LA. What a way to be introduced to the casting and producing community. So I had waited, 10 years of my career, children's theater, dinner theater, the whole thing, and worked up to that. And I said, this is the show I go to LA with. So I heard that Lee and Ellen were going, but I didn't hear that I was going. So I went up to Howard and I said, Howard, I want to join you in LA. I want to do the LA company. He said, no, I can't do that. And I said, why? He said, this is the flagship. Ellen and Lee are going. I need to keep the flagship strong, and I need to have one of you stay here. And I said, okay, well, we have competing agendas because I really, really want to go to LA with this show. And he said, no, sorry, you're not. And I said, well, then you're just going to have to cast 2 Warrens instead of 1. Because he said, you're not leaving a hit show. I said, I don't want to leave a hit show, but I'm going to leave a hit show because I have to try to find another one because I have to go to LA with one. And so I gave my notice early on in the run and put it up on the bulletin board next to the sign-up sheet. And so Howard said, okay, well then I have to cast 2 Warrens. A week later, he came up to me and he said, okay, you get your way. I could only find one guy who could do it because it's Oren and everyone else. It's like 7 parts. It's not an easy thing to cast. And so, he said, however, you have made nothing but enemies. So, Cameron McIntosh, Bill Schoenfeld, David Geffen, Howard Ashman, Alan Menken. Other than that, we're not too many enemies, but yeah. So basically the entire producing and creative staff were pissed that I forced their hand to take me to LA. So he loved me in the show, but I don't think they ever let go of that because I was never invited to any of these functions before. So Adam wrote a book, and then so no, I was not involved.
Was the LA production successful? Was it
For LA? It was.
Yes.
You have to understand. Dreamgirls ran 3 months in LA. Dreamgirls was the longest hit here, and so we went to. This is so LA. We went to the Westwood Theater, which is right next to UCLA. And in order to walk into the Westwood Theater, which is now the Geffen Theater, in order to walk into it, you had to walk through a furniture store. a little different than walking through Skid Row to get to the Orpheum, you know. From the time you get off the train at 8th and Broadway, just walking St. Mark's Place to the show. But totally different. We had to walk through a modern Danish furniture store, so immediately you knew that your experience was different. We ran, I believe, 6 months, but Lee pulled a Frank Luz because Ellen was going to go to London with the show. Lee found out that he was not invited to go to London. He quit. But he really quit. and then a terrific actor came in, and I worked with him for the rest of the run, and that was Brent Spiner, who you guys know as Data in Star Trek Next Generation, but he was a very, very brilliant singer, actor. I mean, he was in Sunday in the Park with George Bennett. He was I was excited to work with him, although I love Lee. To this day, I love Lee. And he's unique. There's no one who can do it like Lee, like Ellen doing Audrey. But, and then the original one who was cast as Audrey, I worked with her, Faith Prince, who is another amazingly talented person. And she came in and did Audrey. So I ended up working with a lot of people in those 6 months, and we ran in LA. That's a hit, 6 months. So, but I have to say that the casting community and the producing community loved it, and they kept coming back. But LA just is not a place, at least when I was last there, that supports theater. It's not like New York.
And also, Frank was not there. Frank, when they cast the movie, for those of us that were still in the play, and the movie cast came and sat on the front row and watched us, that was the most clenched teeth performance that you will ever imagine. I mean, it was like, oh, no, because we all auditioned for the film.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, oh, yeah, yeah.
I wasn't invited to it.
But that was, that was kind of heart-wrenching. And now that I look back on it, but back then, that all, all that going on and going out, who was going to London, who was going to do the movie, who was going to, it was.
But as we're talking here, there's one name that hasn't been mentioned very much. We hear a lot about Howard Ashman, but I haven't heard much from any of you about Alan Menken.
I just talked about his beautiful rock tenor voice.
Well, but was he around rehearsals? Did he talk to
Alan
actors?
is as brilliant with music as Howard is with conception, direction, lyrics, book. I mean, they're two brilliant people. Alan was so facile. So Howard would say, Alan, I want to do that thing or something. And Alan would go, it's like he is, the two of them were incredibly facile and brilliant. That's why they work so well together.
Did he work with actors? Did he interact with the actors?
Well,
Howard show.
Howard was everything. Flamboyant. You do the blah, 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 blah. Alan stuck at that piano. They had a very good, that was the best collaboration. Okay, I've heard some things about Rodgers and Hammerstein. I've heard, one of them was an alcoholic and the other one helped the other one and all of that. But theirs was, it was probably the best marriage ever. Alan is still married to who he was married to then. But Alan knew when to be quiet. He knew that Howard, he told me quietly, he said, Sheila, he's the best. I don't mess with him.
In Adam's book, he recounts the fact that Alan tells him Howard was the boss.
Mm-hmm.
So we all knew Howard.
So his name doesn't get mentioned in the same way because he didn't interact.
But he's
with
held in
people
the
same way.
same level of respect for his brilliance, musical brilliance.
He has
So-
8 Oscars now.
Well, he probably made more money from music than anybody but Andrew Lloyd Webber, or even more.
I think he has 8 Oscars.
I mean, an amazing career,
Yeah.
and it started with your show.
Yeah.
Tell us what you're doing now, Sheila and Frank, bring us up to date.
Well, I have had a theater company for the past 21 years. I was over at, the Roundabout Theater is the Duke Theater Building. I had an office there for 17 years. And now I'm still producing shows, and I've been getting some new musical theater interest just due to the fact of all the new playwrights and new songwriters that I'm developing. So It's
So
been a
you've stayed
good
in the
life.
theater and you're a
I've been in
producer
the-
primarily.
Well, I also do a lot of commercials and voiceovers to make a living. And you said the Lambs founded Screen Actors Guild?
Yes.
Wow, I'm vested in my Screen Actors Guild pension. So,
And the actors, and the Actors Fund paid my rent once, so I'm very fond of the Actors Fund.
yes, yeah. It's a good life if you can, and this is what I tell my daughter, because she's a young theater practitioner. You just have to suck it up and keep going.
But you've done that.
Yeah, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. After Little Shop, I worked at the Public Theater, I worked at the Hartford Stage, I did tours, I've done film, I've done some television, nothing really, I've had some friends who really hit. You know, Angela Bassett, Samuel Jackson, I mean, Viola Davis, they're all come from theater. I never really wanted that type of scrutiny and that type of, that's a lot. But what I did want was a satisfying personal life and a good life with good friends in theater. And that I have, don't I, Nancy?
Today, you worked in soap operas and TV and did a lot of work over the years.
I don't do that now. No, I got in my 50s, I had sucked up about all I could suck up of chasing work. And around my mid-50s, I don't know, I just sort of like got tired of chasing. I had replaced Tom Wopat in City of Angels, and I was doing that, and we had to do it. The leading man had to do a stunt in that where you were handcuffed to a bar and you had to kind of pull yourself up over and land and come down. It was a reverse kind of, a lot of stomach work to do that. But I landed the wrong way. I hurt my knee. In fact, I ended up having surgery on it. And then something happened in those 4 or 5 weeks, you know, where I had surgery and was mending. I just thought, I don't really want to go back. I don't know. I don't know what happened exactly, but I just hit like a wall or something. I said, I just need to step away for a while. I need a break. And that break has lasted to this day. But I just got new headshots today. And I'm ready to throw myself back in again. But now I don't have to worry about paying the rent and all that. with all
Oh,
the
it feels so much
pensions.
better.
Yeah.
Okay, Adam,
So
is
now
there-
it'd be a choice.
Adam, is there anything I've left out that you'd like to add or comment on? It's
No,
a very
this was-
fine book. We're going to have a book signing afterwards. It's really a good book. It's thoroughly researched, and you see our two charming guests that have a lot to say in the book. And Adam's obviously a good interviewer because he gets a lot of good information from everybody. Well, not everybody, but talk to everybody else.
This was really thorough. I'll just mention one more thing about Ellen Greene, since you suggested that I cast her in negative light. She does deserve credit because she really created, in a sense, the character of Audrey. If you go back and look at the Roger Corman film, there is a woman named Audrey, and Seymour does love her, but she's a totally different Audrey. She is Jackie Joseph. She has dark hair. She's not the character that Ellen created when she did the show. Ellen decided that the character would be a blonde, even though Ellen herself has dark hair. And she said once she found the wig, she sort of found the character. So in a way like Laurence Olivier, she kind of worked from the outside in, but she really deserves credit for creating this iconic figure, aided and abetted by Ashman's writing, but it's not the Audrey that you see in the Roger Corman film. It is her own invention in a way. So maybe I don't give her enough credit for that, but it would indicate that she did accomplish something there.
Also, Ellen got there first. So while we were trying to find that balance, and it was very difficult to find, you know, being rooted in the character, but also funny, she got there first. So in a way, she was easily the star of the, well, not in a way, she was the star of the show. And she carried the show, and then when we started getting audiences, those who perform, you know, you don't really know what you have until you put an audience in front of you, and all of a sudden you go, there's a laugh there, or there's a, you know, the whole shape of it starts coming together, and then we all, you know, started owning the role. Ellen owned it first. So Ellen was absolutely, as difficult as she might have been to work with, Ellen was the spine of the show. I'm not sure that the show would have been as successful. I'm pretty sure it might not have been without Ellen. So Ellen, again, the reason Howard put up with whatever he was going to have to put up with, because he knew she would deliver. So.
And she delivered every performance.
Oh,
Every
single,
performance.
she never took a minute off.
But I never thought of a PhD. I never thought that we would be having this type of conversation 40 years later, ever in a million years, that Little Shop would inspire actual academics to be involved. I just never thought it. I never, after 1987 when it ended, I never thought of it again.
Don't you go to show you never know?
See, you never know. You know, you never know. With each breath you take, you just never know. So I'm just so happy and pleased to see all of you and to be introduced to the Lambs. And thank you so much to you for writing such a great book. I enjoyed it. And Frank, it's such a pleasure to see you again after many, many years. And thank you so
Thank
much.
you, thank you. I think that's a wonderful close.